So I'm going to talk a little bit about serious games for medical education and training. And my background is computer science, VR in particular, or spatial sound in particular, with obviously a VR twist. And this really led into this, serious games. After I got to UIT, I started looking into this serious gaming realm, particularly for medical education, after being approached from some medical folks to help them out with some issues they were having in some development that they wanted. But I've kind of, and I'll explain this as the talk goes on, I've actually merged the two fields together, so spatial sound and sound in general together with serious gaming, because games should be, they're not always, but they should be multimodal. Okay? And sound is often overlooked, although it's an integral part of, it's an integral part of our being, just in general in the real world. Often ignored, although that is changing, fortunately. But nonetheless, so I'll give some introduction, motivation, talk about some of the work that I've been doing, some things to consider, some open problems more specifically, that's where you really tie in the sound with the games, and then some concluding remarks. And of course, what I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to talk about work. Of course, I can't take all the credit for it because my students and colleagues like Karen, for example, and Alvaro, who's sitting here, have done a lot of it too. Okay, so I just help them with writing papers. They do the work. So yeah, and the other thing too is I'm kind of tailoring this. I was hoping there'd be more students here, undergrads perhaps, but nonetheless, I think it's some interesting info. There's some good opportunities in the serious gaming realm for graduates of gaming and multimedia type programs. Jobs that were not even, you wouldn't even think about, say, 10 years ago. When you have companies like CAE, the big simulator company, having job postings for game designers, specifically for game designers, that's kind of it's kind of a sign that games are here and they're not leaving. Okay, so I think there's keep that in mind as I go through. So before I start, I like to use kind of, although it's not necessarily the case in this crowd, but when I give talks to like medical folks or even some other educators and what have you, there was this real doubt of games in education, and games did have that stigma as a waste of time. Fortunately, that too is changing. But I recall being in Japan. Remember that conference we were at in Japan, and I started talking about games for training, and there was this real hostile individual there that said, no, you can't use games for training. It's like useless. I thought, oh, geez, that was like slide one of my talk. I mean, what am I going to do here? But he was an interesting person, but nonetheless. So I think something to just go back in time, and a lot of it is really fear and not knowing what games are and how they can be used, but only paying attention to what we hear in the media and games and violence and what have you. So this goes back to a long time. It's not specific to games. If you look at technology in general, Socrates, he complained that learning to write would diminish the memory capacity of his students. So going back a couple thousand years ago. And of course, the famous, Marshall McLuhan quote, anyone who makes a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either one. So it kind of just sets the mood of where we're going to in the talk. And the other thing that I want to point out, what I try to tie together is simulation, gaming, play and gaming, and then it all ties into serious games. So I'll take a few minutes and I'll do that. Even though, again, for this crowd here, it's probably, I don't have to convince you of the need for games and education. I hope not, anyways, for the most part. But in a lot of other places, I do. So simulation, if we look at simulation itself, I probably don't have to explicitly define it. Pretty well know what simulation means. But we've been using simulation for thousands of years, or humans have for thousands of years, and it started off as a military practice, essentially. And you had ancient Greek and Roman soldiers. They would, their armies essentially would practice their sword techniques on a tree trunk. And then it progressed from there. You started getting into more realistic models. The tree trunk represented a model of the enemy soldier. And later they would hang small tree trunks or parts of a tree trunk on a tree with string, and that would swing, and that would, give the enemy a more realistic presence, or the fidelity would increase. And then, after that, again, this progressed. And then it started being used in medicine. Simulation has been very popular in medicine. And really in medicine, it got its start from midwifery in the mid-1600s. And then it has progressed from there. But it really is common. I mean, if you look at, whoever has taken a plane, the pilot that's in the plane that you're flying, in the commercial airliner that you're flying, has guaranteed trained on a flight simulator. And because of simulation, prior to simulation, the use of simulation in training pilots, just as an example, pilots, there'd be a lot of crash landings in fog, many deaths. As soon as simulation came about and they were able to simulate landing in fog, that went away. So just the importance of simulation. Sports, obviously, boxing is a good example of simulation, punching the bag, the focus mitts, and what have you. Widely used in military training. If you look at the U.S. military, they've spent, hundreds of if not billions of dollars on virtual-based training technologies and techniques. And it goes back to 1980 when they used a battle zone. Or a modified version of Battle Zone from Atari to train Army gunners, or tank gunners, sorry. And it's widely used in medical education too. So simulation, you can have, of course, mannequins, physical mannequins, so you have physical simulation. But the trend is to move towards more virtual type scenarios, as this virtual dental trainer over here. So that's simulation. And just to kind of step over into play. And, play, again, we know what play is. We all play. And, you can define it, many ways to define it, but engage in an activity for enjoyment and recreation rather than for a serious or a practical purpose. And, animals and humans have been learning by playing for thousands of years. So when we play, it's not only fun, we actually learn a lot. And a good example of that is if you consider the animal kingdom, and lions in particular. If you look at a male, or the male lion in this case, it has a technique for taking down its prey. Now, as gruesome as that may seem, it has to take down its prey so that it can eat and survive. And in order to do that, a lion, how does it, it follows this technique. How does it actually learn that technique? There's no mother lion teaching on a blackboard. That doesn't happen. Well, they learn by playing. And if you look at the lion cubs here at the bottom, they're mimicking essentially the behavior that the adult lion uses to take down its prey. And they mimic that, and they do that over and over. And that's really their day. Their day is spent sleeping and playing, and eating, of course. And you can see that in a kind of, this is a good example of it. But again, so here they're playing. They're not injuring themselves for the most part, yet they're learning, life-saving survival skills, how to take down prey, eat, and survive. And they do that by playing. If we look at games, continuing on with play, games can be kind of looked at as formalized play. So you have play with, additional, with rules added. And, of course, games are more of a they're uniquely human behavior. Even though animals play, they don't necessarily play games, or at least for the most part. And then, of course, if we look at video games, they're games, no different than any other game, but now the medium has changed essentially. And we're playing a game by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program on a computer display or some form of display. And of course, there's plenty of learning that occurs when playing a game. And a good example of that is, when you play a game, you don't necessarily, you don't go from the start to the end immediately. It takes a lot of trial and error and doing and experimenting and what have you. So there's a lot of learning going on. Don't mean to date myself here, but, video games, of course, it's global, huge global market, a fairly strong global market, despite, kind of decreases in other markets and in other areas. Gaming has fared very well. Grand Theft Auto, there's a whole bunch of, I'm not going to go through the stats here, but you can take a look at that. So, the point here is that games are big. People are playing games. It's not a fad. They're not going anywhere. They're here to stay. And this kind of leads, or this does lead into this whole notion of serious gaming. And serious games, I mean, there's like I mentioned, there's a lot of learning that happens in games. We're playing a lot of games. Well, the next progression is, well, let's use games for specific educational applications. And really, that's what serious games can be defined as. And there's many definitions of serious games, but essentially it all boils down to video games whose primary purpose is educational. Not the greatest term, serious gaming, because it implies that it's only, learning is serious, where in fact learning should be fun as well. So, and this really goes back to, I'm going to tie it all together now. So, simulation, we've been using it for thousands of years. Go to any, medical any medical program, people learn, or the trainees learn via simulation, physical and virtual. We've been playing games for thousands of years. I mean, the oldest games historically date back to like 4500 BC, ancient Iraq and Egypt, that we know, and they could even go further. So why not really combine, games, combine it all? And really that's where we get into serious games. Serious games are games which in themselves are simulations. So it really all ties together. And again, I don't have to use, I don't have to convince an audience such as yourselves here, but when you look at all these naysayers, when you really kind of break it down like this, it does make sense. So yeah. And of course, if we look at serious gaming, for the students here that are going to be graduating and looking for work, this represents an actual, a lot of good opportunities. One, there's a lot of open problems, as we'll talk about later, but it's a growing market too. And, it's been estimated to be between 2 and 10 billion, 2014. And I mean, there's a lot of, primarily the serious gaming market, or at least in Canada. In the US, there's some big players, thanks in part to the military and the big funding that they're giving. Like Breakaway Games has done a lot of work for the US armed services, tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions. But here in Canada, March 2015, Ubisoft, they released Dig Rush, and I think there was a talk about the game here at some point. But nonetheless, so now you're getting these big players like Ubisoft, at least looking at serious gaming. So, hopefully it will become far more mainstream as these big players come in, the Ubisofts and the EAs and what have you. And like I mentioned earlier at the start of my talk, there's a lot of opportunities here, things that game designers may not have necessarily thought of as a possible career option or a career path. CAE, the big simulator company, Canadian simulator company, they had openings for game developers, and as of a few weeks ago, they had openings for multimedia developers. And multimedia encompasses games and not only games, of course, but games are a part of it. Mobile, that's another big thing, again, for opportunities for grads or recent grads. And things are moving to a mobile platform. And if we look at serious games, particularly for medical education, I mean, this applies really to anything, but focusing on medical, it is a cost-effective alternative. Now, before I go further, what I really want to point out is that I'm not arguing games replacing these expensive labs and these, and traditional learning environments. By no means. I believe that they could be used as an additional tool in that, toolbox of tools that we have as educators. They have their place. They can't solve everything. There's a lot of issues that we have to overcome before they can be used in many, instances. But nonetheless, they do present some really good. They have a good fit in many cases. Sim labs. If you look at medical simulation labs that have these, very expensive and complicated mannequins, these cost, millions of dollars to build, let alone to maintain. Someone has to maintain them, and they're limited. You don't have a lot of these spaces, and there's a lot of contention for them spending time in them. So what you want to make sure is that the trainees, when they enter these labs, they're well prepared, and they make use, most efficient use of the limited time that they have in there. So a good way to do that is using games or virtual sims to prepare students or the trainees about the equipment in the lab, how to use the equipment, how to use the mannequins, how to do all that. So I believe that they're right now, with the tech that we have, they're a good first step into, other more complex training systems. Of course, games, and virtual sims, in general, you can do, they're cost effective for the most part. I mean, they could be expensive to develop, but for the we'll say they're cost effective. They're convenient, 24/7. You can play them on your mobile device. Okay, so you have access everywhere. And the other nice thing too, when you're dealing with team training, it's very difficult to bring in teams of medical experts, even teams of medical experts within the same city. It's very difficult to bring them into one place and have them train together physically. However, if you have virtual technologies such as, games, online remote, sims or games, you can bring them together remotely and they can work. And there's some interesting studies. One example was a study done in New York, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And surgeons who played video games made less errors with respect to laparoscopic surgery. And this was a big study actually. And there was a study done, can't remember where, but they took laparoscopic surgeons and they compared their hand-eye coordination, certain hand-eye coordination tasks, or their ability to, their hand-eye coordination, to kids who played games, and they found that they were the same, or they performed equally. Of course, it doesn't mean that the kids are laparoscopic surgeons, of course not, but they possess the same, with respect to certain hand-eye coordination tasks, they were equal. So yeah, and a lot of surgeons actually do play games, and they've been big proponents of games in general. And I think if you look at serious gaming and virtual sims, I think given there's a lot of technical issues right now with respect to creating sims that will let you go in and perform an actual surgery, like a heart or a bypass, for example. I personally believe that right now, where the tech stands, and accounting for cost, they're better aimed at cognitive skills, decision making, looking at a procedure, the steps of the procedure, the tools required at the step, how to handle unforeseen events, that type of thing. Whereas with the technical skills, as I'll talk about a little bit later, it does become complex to really replicate the haptic cues, for example, that you're getting. And although it can be done, the devices to do so are rather expensive and certainly not available widespread. So I think I'll just briefly, I'll show some of the work that I've been involved with. And so this was a game, and I'll give some background because I think it's kind of important to give some background here. There's a group of endocrinologists at Sick Kids in Toronto, and they had an issue with recurrences of teens with type 1 diabetes coming into the emergency room for issues that they should have prevented. So basically not being able to balance their blood sugar levels and insulin levels. And they were given, traditionally, they were given pamphlets essentially, like here's a pamphlet, read this and don't come to the emergency room because you're going to know everything about it. But that wasn't working. And so I was approached by them to develop a game to actually teach adolescents, teens essentially, about diabetes numeracy. And this was what we... So it's modeled after a tower we used a tower defense genre game. And they went through this, and basically you have a power plant that represents the body and what have you. And it was really interesting working with the doctors on this because they made some things clear that we could not deviate from. There was no death in the game, so you can't die. Even though we came up with some, but nonetheless, so that was it. You couldn't, basically, you had this analogy, so there was no notion of glucose and it was energy, represented your blood level, sugar levels and what have you. So it's kind of an implicit an implicit learning model. Okay, so but it actually worked. We ran a couple of fairly large studies at sick kids, and we did find that it was a fairly extensive study, and we did find that it was very effective, and the kids that learned with the game learned better than those that learned with traditional means, that didn't have access to the game. Of course, the game was made available after the study was made available to everyone, and it was on the sick kids website. I can't remember, it might still be on there. So that was, and the students that worked on this, they actually started, they were UIT gaming students. They started their own serious gaming company, and it was a good, it's a great thing for them. Some of the other work we've done, this one here was an exercise game to promote rehab and shoulder rehab in particular. And this was with a rehab doctor who developed this unique, he called the helium-6 baton, that's just the name he used. And it was essentially a device, a physical device, like a rowing, to simulate certain rowing movements. And it was developed specifically to rehabilitate shoulder injuries. He's a rehab doctor, but he's also a kayaker. He injured his shoulder, and he came up with this system. You perform certain exercises, and it helps rehabilitate your shoulder. And what he found was that, I mean, it works. People were buying the device, but very quickly they lost motivation, and they weren't using it after. They weren't really using it. And he had some pamphlets again describing the exercises, and I think he had a few videos. So again, with him, we devised a game to take care of that. And I think, yeah, there's video. And this is like going a few years back. It's Kinect-based, so it uses a Kinect to basically, you have somebody physically, well, yeah, you can see that. We capture the movements, and then they're mapped into gameplay. And you compare the movements to a set of references that we've made with expert kayakers, and you'll see an example of that. So, for those that are interested in moving into the serious game realm, students looking for, looking at this as work, you have to keep in mind that this is very interdisciplinary, and you can't, I'm a computer scientist. I can come up with the tech, but I'm not an expert in kayaking, for example. I'm not an expert in diabetes. I'm also not an education expert. And so you really have to work together. It's very interdisciplinary. And that in itself presents some interesting challenges because, sometimes in different disciplines, we use different terms to mean the same thing, and that causes confusion. And, I don't have a video here, but I had some of my students put together little videos about what it's like to work at an interdisciplinary team. And I like one of them, and Karen, like Brent, he made a comment about how, it's actually quite simple. I talk with the medical doctors, and I make it clear to them, you don't talk Latin and Greek, and I won't talk geek. And, it kind of worked, so they were able to, so it is, and then a lot of times too, Brent, for example, when he went, he put together a game for a knee replacement with some surgeons at Mount Sinai. And, he went, he had to obviously observe some surgeries and what have you. And one day he went and they had a cadaver, literally just the leg. So he didn't expect this. So he goes into the OR with them and he just saw this cadaver leg, like just a leg. And, they started, he had a camera, he was ready to record. And they started drilling through the knee and going through the knee replacement procedure because he needed to see that and record that. And, there was like everything flying and he got all, yeah. So he didn't, so it's, he was completely shocked by that. And then the surgeons went for lunch. So, it's kind of it was a shock to him. But nonetheless, if you're moving in this realm, you have to work with others. And, certain practices and certain terminology and what have you have to become aware of. This was a game that we worked with. This was actually a class project, and it was basically an app that the students put together to address an issue with emergency contraception awareness. And again, this was with some doctors at Women's College in Toronto, and similar problem. A lot of younger adults. They had an issue with knowing what their options are with respect to emergency contraception. And again, traditionally done with, pamphlets essentially that are distributed. And that's not a very effective means of doing that. And so we developed this app to help educate and provide information to those who may need this information. So we actually delivered this to them, and they're going to be conducting some studies with it. But just to give you an idea of where this stuff goes. And here's an example of the knee game. Just check for time, okay. So again, this too was, so this goes back about maybe 5-6 years ago, if not more. This looked, we had some, again, restrictions with, it's been animated now and what have you, but we have some restrictions with, the doctors, they wanted certain things and they had to be like that. So they wanted a very simplistic interface to represent what a user, or there is some, I won't go through the, there's actual video footage. So they had some, they wanted video footage of actual surgeries or of an actual surgery and what have you. So there were restrictions. Again, Brent was working on this and he would pitch some ideas and they would say, no, we can't do this. And you try to tell them, no, it would be good. No, it's not good and what have you. So, but nonetheless, ultimately they're the users of the tech. They're the experts. So we do listen to what they say. There's a few other stuff, a few other things, Z-plasty for plastic surgery training. And then this is some work that another student did, which is looking at the cultural competence. And in this project here, it's really one of the issues they're having in medicine here in Canada. Despite the cultural diversity in the population, medicine still hasn't followed yet. I mean, it's changing, obviously, but it still hasn't followed yet. And you're having a lot of times where the doctor and the patient are of different cultures, and that presents, or even of different gender, and that in itself presents some interesting challenges. So with using sim or virtual sims or games to at least highlight and perhaps go through some scenarios that and some encounters that a doctor may have. Kind of highlights the you can do things that and have them better prepared in the real world. So one of the cases that we looked or scenarios that we looked at, you have a young male doctor with an elderly female patient, and the doctor walks in with I can't remember the name of the patient, hi Edna or hi Jane, I can't remember, it doesn't really matter. And you have the patient getting upset because, hey, I'm this older person, where's your respect? You can't just call me by first name. And these are actual cases from medical training manuals and what have you. So you're able to do this, and you're able to go through different scenarios, and you can try different things. You can have different outcomes, and then we tied also emotion into it, so happy, sad, angry, and how the doctor's response or the trainee's response can affect the emotion and what have you. So there's a lot of things you can do here, which you can try different things, and you have different outcomes, and you can experience them in a very ethically safe manner. Okay, and that prepares you better to the what you're going to experience in the real world. And there's a few other ones. I'm not going to go through all of these. But where I'm going now and what Brent is doing now, so he's working on his PhD, he's creating this framework. And the framework itself, we call it the Serious Game Surgical Cognitive Education and Training Framework, just because you add more words to it, it sounds more complicated and sounds more important. He's really progressing with this. And what we're doing is we're creating a framework that will that allows the user, and the user here being the educator or the trainer, to use the framework and develop these serious games in a fairly easy manner. Now this is rather interesting because when you look at, one of the things that he's done is he's analyzed or done some studies to look at how much time is an educator, medical educator, willing to put in to develop a game if they had the tools to do so. And the answer to that is not a lot. They're very busy people. And are they willing to put a lot of time to develop a game, let alone time to use a tool to develop the game, or learn to use a tool that develops the game? So this presents some really interesting problems, but nonetheless, he's made some good good progress in that realm. And it does turn out that a lot of the or at least from the studies that we've shown, a lot of the medical folks, the medical educators, and medical folks in general, are actually very tech savvy, and they do like technology, and they are willing to learn to use tools if it can give them, if there's a big advantage to them, of course, which makes sense. And so he's developing the tool. There's a WYSIWYG, you know, drag and drop components of an operating room, for example, and you put together the operating room, and then you can define, you know, scenarios within it. And that framework itself, what we're doing with the framework is we're allowing it, in addition to being useful as a tool for education and training purposes, we're also using it to, it's a research framework where we're able to change various parameters of the simulation, like the realism, or let's say the fidelity of the graphics, the sound and that type of thing. And that allows us to examine the role of these multimodal interactions. What role does sound have on our perception of visual fidelity, for example, or graphical fidelity? And that, believe it or not, has a lot of implications, because when we look at, although we have a lot of, you know, computing power available to us, if you look at the majority of a student's laptop in medical school, it's not the most powerful, they're not the most powerful computers. And if you want very, very high fidelity graphics, you need a lot of computing power. And a lot of the computers we have to date don't allow that. So there's implications there. If you can reduce the rendering requirements, you can make things faster, and you can have more, you can be dynamic and interactive and that type of thing. So there's a lot of interesting questions that we're looking at with that. Yeah, there's some other work too. I won't move into that. I'll show another video, just some other work. This ties in, I think I have a video, yeah. This is some work that we're doing with Alvaro and another colleague in Japan. Comment here. So this is, we're aiming here specifically for anatomy education. And one of the things that we're trying to do here is, this is a rigged prototype we built very quickly in Japan, just kind of as a proof of concept. But what you're trying to do here is, if you look at, with anatomy education, you know, you can use a tabletop display. It actually lends itself nicely, because if you look at anatomy, traditional anatomy education, you have a cadaver or even a mannequin on a table, and you have the students around the table with the instructor, and they look at components and what have you. So what we're doing here is, with virtual, we can actually do that. We can get rid of the mannequin and all the issues, or sorry, the cadaver and all of the issues associated with it. And what we can do is now put it all on in the virtual domain. But when you're dealing with the virtual domain on one tabletop display, you still have this one-size-fits-all approach. So what we're doing is we're trying to personalize the education that each trainee receives, or at least the training that each trainee receives, by coupling mobile devices to that. So now, in addition to the main tabletop display, each trainee also has a tabletop, or a tablet, or even a phone, or a mobile device, and they can augment the information, augment information on that global view. So now, if you have a novice trainee, they can, you know, basically with their tabletop, they can get that same view that's on the main tabletop, but now they can augment, you know, labels to label the body parts, for example, or the certain structure of the body. So that's that work there. So I think, you know, just to give you an example of some of the work that I've done, or myself and others, one of the things I mentioned realism, and I'll just briefly go through some of this stuff and then wrap up. But, you know, realism. So this does have a lot of implications due to, you know, if we look at rendering needs for highly realistic environments. But we also have to keep in mind that perfect realism is impossible to achieve with our current tech. We can't do that. And if you don't believe me, you know, if you want to create realism, perfect realism, you have to consider all of the senses, and olfactory being one of them, for example. And although we can simulate olfactory somewhat, we can't do so. I mean, it's very poorly done. I mean, there's some work out of Japan and some other places, but, you know, olfactory we can't simulate. So bang, right there, we don't have perfect, we can't simulate realism perfectly, let alone even with graphics and sound. There's issues, right? I mean, we're not perfect at it. It has generally been accepted that high realism is needed, and this goes in not only in games. I think in games too. I mean, games are a good example. Everything was high fidelity graphics and better graphics, which is not necessarily a bad thing because it really gave us a lot of the computing power that we have. That's all thanks in part to this drive for better and better graphics. So again, if you look at simulation, physical and virtual, both in general, it was generally accepted that high realism is better, leads to better training, better learning. However, a number of recent studies have indicated that this is not the case. So realism and fidelity, I'll use the word fidelity. I don't like to use it because they call it the F word and it has different meanings and what have you. But nonetheless, there are studies that indicate it's not the case. And it's a very complex thing. And it really depends on a number of factors, including the level of the trainee, so whether they're novice or intermediate or advanced, and on the task itself. And if you look at a lot of the surgical skills, or the basic surgical skills like suturing, they're actually done in very low fidelity. They actually practice suturing on an orange, for example. They go through and that's not high fidelity at all, yet it teaches some fundamental skills. So it depends on the task. Well, what is it you're looking at? Well, you're looking at passing the needle through, learning that particular skill. And you can do that with an orange, a very low fidelity model. And again, it's kind of a scaffolding effect. So the realism should increase as the level of the trainee progresses. Or at least that's what the evidence indicates. So striving for high realism can burden the computational resources, particularly with mobile computing platforms. Even though we're getting better and better and faster processors, it still is a problem. And of course, as you do that, as you really tax the rendering capabilities and the computational or the processor capabilities, of course you increase the probability of lag and you can get into simulator sickness and what have you. And of course it leads to increased development costs. So how much realism is really needed to maximize learning? And how do multimodal interactions affect learning? And this has been the focus of a lot of the work that I'm doing now together with Karen and Alvaro recently and some others. And we're really looking at kind of what effect does all this have on learning, multimodal interactions, audiovisual in particular, and what effect does sound, for example, have on our perception of visual fidelity? And it actually does. It does affect our perception of visual fidelity. Just something to consider here too. We had this drive for better and better graphics, starting off with Pong and moving and progressing as we moved along. And then came along the Nintendo Wii. And, really that kind of shattered everything. This whole notion of higher fidelity graphics, this is not high fidelity by no means. Yet, how many people use the Wii? It kind of revolutionized, gaming to some degree, right? And really it placed the importance on the interaction and the Wiimote at the time and what have you. So yeah, multimodal interactions. As I pointed out, we've been doing a lot of work in this domain, and one of the things, again, this too is not simple. Because a lot of the effects that, for example, sound on graphical fidelity perception is very subjective. And so what does this mean? We're currently using, or at least generally speaking, we have a one-size-fits-all approach where we have a game or a sim and it's one-size-fits-all. Everyone gets the same interface. Well, if you look at sound and visuals and haptics, there's a lot of subjectivity that comes into play here. So a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily the best way to go. And one of the things we're looking at is calibrating for each individual. That too in itself is not easy, and a lot of times calibration before the start of a game or a sim turns people off. They don't want to spend time calibrating and what have you. So striking a balance is not, how much time do you have to calibrate versus, how personal you make it. But nonetheless, I think we should move towards a personalized approach. And personalized with respect to the interface, but also with respect to the learning that occurs within the games. One size fits all is not necessarily the best way because people learn differently. Everyone learns differently and at a different pace. So why not have the game be adaptive to assess on the fly, so to speak, and adapt the level of difficulty as the player is progressing without them even necessarily knowing that. So yeah, I think won't go through too much. And currently, right now, we're looking at, so we've done a lot of work in the audio-visual domain, and now we're tying this into haptics. And if you look at haptics, simulating haptics or accurate haptics, at least accurate with respect to medical simulation and training, the haptic devices are tens of thousands of dollars. But there are some very cheap gaming haptic devices, like the Novit Falcon. I don't know if you guys have ever used that here. But nonetheless, this is about 300 or 400 American dollars, which is probably 15,000 Canadian dollars currently. But nonetheless, this lets you, accuracy is it's far less than what you would expect from a very accurate haptic device. The degrees of freedom are less, but nonetheless, you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. So what if we can complement the haptic cues with sound to kind of compensate for that low fidelity, low accuracy haptic feedback that we get with this? And that's kind of where we're going at now. Customizing the user interface. So yeah, and with that, calibrating, I had a student put together a calibration game where we looked at visual fidelity here, and we had a left side, we had one game running on two sides in two screens essentially, and it was the same game, but each version or each of the two versions had a different fidelity level, so to speak, and you would kind of go through and pick and choose as you would in a typical ophthalmology test. So yeah, I like the left screen better. So you keep the left screen, replace the right screen, and you kind of keep going through that until you find the optimal one. So I kind of skimmed through that, or I went through it quickly, but I just want to point out here that when we look at, serious games are fairly, we can develop them, we can make them. I can make a game on, to teach anything, but is it effective and will it work? So that's the hard part. Developing the games right now is nothing novel per se. I mean, you get enough people working at it and you throw enough money at it, you can develop anything you want. But developing a game that's effective is extremely difficult. It brings together, it's a very interdisciplinary approach. You have to have, the game developers, obviously. You have to have the content experts, right? The surgeons or the math expert or whatever the content may be. You have to also have the educator. So we can't ignore the importance of instructional design. And that's often ignored. And when we do that, we get very poor games or non-effective games, games that don't meet their objectives. So, if you go to any, app store, you'll find, thousands and thousands and thousands of games for teaching and training. How many of them have been properly validated or tested? Very few. And of course, it's very difficult to do that. It takes time and what have you. But nonetheless, there's a lot of bad examples out there. So, in terms of, there's also a lot of open problems with respect to the interface and the multimodal interactions and fidelity and realism. And, so we have to look at these things if we want to make, these all have an effect. And there's been many studies that have shown that, the level of fidelity and what have you, these can affect ultimately learning and retention. Just as another example, stereoscopic 3D. Do we invest in it? Do we use it? Well, depends. Some studies show yes, some studies show no. So do you actually go ahead and render add the complications associated with stereoscopic 3D and using devices such as the Oculus? You have to render the scene twice, each frame and what have you. Is it worth doing? Well, studies indicate both yes and no. So there's a lot more work to do. So there's plenty of open problems, which is a good thing because there's a lot of opportunities. And there's a lot of opportunities for us here, for students going into grad work and research positions, and those that are working. So yeah, and of course, as we improve technology and things become, I'll just show some examples here actually.
We've been teaching human anatomy.
So it's kind of a cool, what technology will let us do.
And it's completely two-dimensional, and the human body isn't.
Microsoft HoloLens is a holographic computer that you wear. It enables you to bring
Does anyone know if this is out yet?
the world into your real world.
Is it out? Not yet.
At Case Western Reserve University, we are focused on solving problems and creating new knowledge.
My job is to teach, and I really think this could impact almost everything that we teach people. With HoloLens, you can see the muscles on top of the skeleton.
So this, of course, is, a demo, obviously, and a promotional video. But this is kind of cool. Like if you could do stuff like this, and which we will be able to very soon.
Translucent, so you can see through the outside, and that really helped me understand how cardiac anatomy worked. I actually had a moment where I found the aortic valve, and it was the first time that I'd actually seen the aortic valve in relation to all the other anatomical structures. It was a way of seeing it that you couldn't do with an actual heart.
So it's cool stuff, right? Tech is cool. Whoops, sorry. And just another example here.
My name is Ivan Pubarev, and I work for...
Maybe you guys have seen this.
Group at Google. The hand is the ultimate input device. It's extremely precise, it's extremely fast, and it's very natural for us to use it, right? Capturing the possibilities of human hand was one of my passions. How can we take this incredible capability, finesse of human...
So think of this as an input interface. This is kind of neat. And he'll show what it...
We use radio frequency spectrum, which is radars, to track human hand. The radars has been used for many different things. To track cars, big objects, satellites and planes. We're using them to track micro motions, twitches of human hands, and then use that to interact with wearables and Internet of Things and other computing devices.
Our team is focused on taking radar hardware and turning it into a gesture sensor. Radar is a technology which transmits a radio wave towards a target, and then the receiver of the radar intercepts the reflected energy from that target. The reason why we're able to interpret so much from this one radar signal is because of the full gesture recognition pipeline that we've built. The various stages of this pipeline are designed to extract specific gesture information from this one radar signal that we receive at a high frame rate.
From these strange foreign range Doppler signals.
So yeah, no need to go through that, the whole thing, but nonetheless, you get the idea. As technology improves, this actually, we have a lot of great opportunities here. We can probably do some really cool stuff with that in terms of, interface and input, designing, unique and novel interfaces. So yeah, I think, I talked a little bit about the technology here, but just that, just to end, it's not only about the technology, but it's really how we use the technology. And when we're dealing with serious games, they're not the end-all. It's not the end-all solution, right? They're a tool. It's not going to get rid of traditional teaching. There's no need to fear them. They're an additional tool that can be used in some places very effectively when used properly. But there's a lot of issues. There's technological issues that we have to still consider. Rendering, one thing, and realism, and that whole thing, and the multimodal cues and haptic devices. But then there's also issues with how they're incorporated in the curriculum. Where do they fit? Where do they fall into? The educators that are using them, they have to have knowledge in these tools as well, because if any problems that the students have, they'll seek the educator. If the educator can't use the tool, well, students lose faith in the tool itself. So there's a lot of issues that need to be considered. But keep in mind that tech also has limitations. Serious games, as I said, it's an additional tool. And we have to be careful to consider the team and the resources to create an effective and useful product. You have to consider from the onset, you should consider what your learning objectives are. And that's something that typically is not done. We just jump into development without really considering what is it we're developing and why are we developing it for. And of course, ongoing research is needed to inform what we do, because there's a lot of open questions. But that's a good thing, because it means there's more work to be done. And on that note, I won't say it's the end, because it really is not the end. We still have work to be done. And, of course, have to end with these, and onwards we march, right? So, thank you. Not bad.
Are there any questions for Dr. Kapralos?
So you mentioned that you will measure whether a game is effective or not. And, so I just was wondering what's a typical way to measure if a game is effective.
So yeah, that's a good question. So there's a number of ways. Typically, how it's done, or traditionally how it's done, is using a pre and post design. So what you have is you have two groups. One group has the game, another group doesn't. So the one that has the game is your experimental group. The other is your control group. You measure their knowledge beforehand, both groups, by a test. They both have the same test. They have a base, so you have a base of what their knowledge is. They go through the intervention. Group plays the game. The other group uses traditional, whatever the traditional means is. And after the intervention period, they take another test, the post test. And then what you do is you compare the results of the post-test to the pre-test for both groups. And ideally what you would have is the change or the increase, well, assuming there is an increase, or you're assuming that, the change with the group that had the game would be far greater than the change associated with the control group. And then you attribute that change to the game itself, the intervention itself. It's not that's not perfect. There's a lot of issues with pre and post testing. But it is I guess the standard way of doing it, not only for serious gaming, but also in simulation, in the simulation domain itself, whether it's pilots, whether it's surgeons, whatever the case may be. Now, the good thing is that with the advent of a lot of with improved technology, we can actually augment that with a lot of other things. So we can keep track of, for example, physiological data. Heartbeat, things like that. So you're able to get a better picture of what's going on. So perhaps by monitoring the heart rate, you can figure out where in the game the user is having trouble or difficulty, and so it gives you some. It doesn't tell you if the game is effective, but it gives you a bigger picture, and you can kind of correlate all this data and get a better picture of the game, what it's doing to the user, and what have you. And there's other questionnaires like engagement, the engagement questionnaire, where you can look at whether a game is engaging, and if it's engaging, engagement has been linked to higher academic, achievement and what have you. So you get other measures, but ultimately it's pre and post testing.
What is the difference between a serious game and a simulation?
Yeah. So so that's a great question too, which often comes up. So the line, well. If you look at a sim, I look at a game as a sim with additional, let's say, requirements. So those requirements would be what it takes to be a game. So you're going to have sims have feedback, but you have to have feedback, although sims can have feedback as well. Feedback, there's a goal, there's a start, there's an end, there's trials along the way and that type of thing. Very similar, but I look at a game as a sim with those additional constraints. So that being said, though, I think it's very easy when you're designing sims and games, it's very easy to design as a sim and then add those components, which is probably not the best way to do it. I think you have to design as a game from the onset and account for those, yeah. And I've seen that I've done that myself too, where we take a sim and make it a game. Not the best way to do it. Yeah, so in there, I think I would argue that the biggest issue is lack of proper design. So you have games that are you don't consider one aside from the instructional aspect, but you don't really consider the game design as well. And like I said, it's very easy to develop a game, but it's very difficult to develop. If you're dealing with serious games, it's very difficult to develop an effective game. But aside from that, a game that's engaging. And there's many examples of games that. Whether it's a serious game or not, if you design a game that's not engaging and doesn't compel the user to use it, it won't be effective. It's not going to be effective. And from that, though, that really the important or designing a game properly. Again, it goes back to the instructional design where you really have to consider the audience. Who's the target audience? What's their age range? That may depend on the type of genre of game you use, for example. What's their background? Are they tech savvy? Will they want to use equipment? Will they want, do they want 2D versus 3D, that type of thing? So part part of that is really just good game design, and part of that includes the instruction, or you know, your needs analysis, or your and looking at doing your background. Your audience, what type of games do they generally play? If they play a specific style of game, maybe you want to mimic that type of game in your design. So I think it all goes down to proper design, or a big part of it goes down to design. And many games are not designed properly. And I'm guilty of that too. I mean,
I'm wondering, like many cases you explained are mostly like for developing developing skills for like training. I'm wondering if there are projects you have been working, or if you are aware of any projects that helping people to change their behavior.
There definitely are. Most of the stuff that I'm doing is really cognitive skills building. There's definitely games that have looked at behavioral change. I can't think of any offhand, but there's many. There's definitely many. Yeah.
So yeah, I just was wondering if you are aware of those which have in long term actually very effective, because like many of those we still don't know if they are working.
Yeah. So very good point. There has been some studies with. I mean, there's very little in terms of effectiveness. I mean, there's more and more coming out now, but generally speaking and traditionally, there's very little emphasis on effectiveness. But there has been some studies looking at behavioral change. Actually just came to mind, stuff with phobias. And they've used games to treat phobias. One that comes to mind is arachnophobia. And they have actually verified the effectiveness with MRI studies and things like that. And there's some other stuff to treat, and there's some, I can't remember it offhand, but there's some other games that were teaching kids, I think it was aimed at kids, about self-confidence and that type of thing. And again, they used MRI data and studies to show the effectiveness. So it's becoming more and more, or there's more studies of that nature coming out, and they do indicate a positive effect. But again, if a game does not, if you do a study and there's no positive effect, it doesn't mean that game-based learning or serious gaming as a field is flawed. It just means that game is not. Yeah, and what I found, like with the few surgeons that I've worked with, they're just motivated on their own. But again, getting them to, like, they're busy people. I mean, I used to joke with a colleague, yeah, they're busy saving lives while we're playing with games, right? I mean, so but it is difficult to get their time. But the guys that I've worked with, they've been really motivated and they love the stuff. And yeah. Well, thanks.
Income's not everything.
True. Yeah, and some of the other surgeons that we work with, they have, I mean, they're associated with the university, so they do have a component of teaching or training, and that's where a lot of the residents that do a master's, for example, and we're actually working with an anesthesia resident. He's at Sunnybrook. He's working with Fareed, maybe you know him, I don't know. Anyways, yeah. But he's actually looking at the use of, he's working with one of my master's students specifically for anesthesia training, the procedures and what have you. So, but again, these guys are, Fareed, I mean, when I first met him, he said, well, I got an Oculus. He bought an Oculus for himself and he's experimenting with it. And, and he's not a computer scientist, obviously. He's a medical person, but he still loves the stuff and plays around with it. So it's great.